You might recall in the previous bit of this, I'd said, Labour haven't got a great electoral track record. And so in some ways, you can see Labour are actually up against it as soon as they lose in 51. So what I want to do now is just quickly go through the history of Labour in the 50s, with, of course, the two questions occur to us: why do they keep losing in the 50s, and how is it they turn that round in 64? Well, I suppose the obvious answer is that in the 50s, I think Labour had two underlying problems. The first underlying problem was they were bitterly divided amongst themselves. Now, it's not always true that divided parties don't win elections. Wilson won elections, and his party was more often divided than united. But it's certainly true that it doesn't help, and it certainly, I don't think, didn't help in the 50s. The second explanation, I said this idea of a song in their hearts. Labour, I think, lacked a kind of coherent message in some ways in the 50s. With the Conservatives occupying what a lot had been traditional Labour ground, Labour couldn't really quite work out where to go next, and this wasn't helped by these internal divisions that meant they couldn't agree about where to go next. And there's also a question of leadership, which brings us to Clement Attlee. You all know my view of Clement Attlee as Prime Minister. I think he was one of the great Prime Ministers. He wasn't a great opposition leader, I think it's fair to say. And in particular, Attlee stayed on beyond his sell-by date. I think that's fair. He stayed on 1455. Now, I used to wonder why, and I still do, really, even having read John Bew's brilliant biography, Scissors and Clem, which is one of the best books I've read in the past couple of years. In part, I think he feared if he went, there would be a lurch to the left. I think he also feared that Herbert Morrison might win it, and he didn't want Morrison to win it, who he didn't trust. So Attlee stayed on, I think probably stayed on without really a clear purpose in doing so. Meanwhile, the Bevanite left, as we would call them, Aneurin Bevan, had resigned from the government in 51 and becomes, during this mid-50s period, the leader of the left in the party in some ways. Well, they were deeply unhappy and actually spent much of their energy fighting their own leadership. In opposition, Labour often want to cleave to a kind of pure socialism. And it's great, I've joked to many of you before, it's all well and good being nice and purely socialist when you're a nice middle-class person. Truth is, they're more interested in their ideological purity than they were in actually being in government, I think. And in these years, I think Labour offered nothing new. I think that helps explain the defeat of 55. After 55, a new leader is elected. And for many of us, Hugh Gaitskell is the great lost Labour leader. Many of us feel he would have made a great Prime Minister. But he didn't. Well, he wasn't without some serious problems when he became leader. For a start, the Bevanites hadn't gone anywhere, and they'd lost, and the infighting would only get worse. They divided over the power of the trade union bloc vote in the party. They divided bitterly over unilateral nuclear disarmament. The left wanted to unilaterally get rid of Britain's nuclear weapon. And the left also wanted to push policy in a more leftward direction towards further nationalisation, towards the great white hope of planning, a planned economy. And these arguments continued to fester in the party and made, I think, making policy actually quite difficult. Now, Gaitskell was brilliant over Suez. I mean, he tore shreds into Eden and again to Macmillan, to be honest with you. But Eden's departure kind of changes that narrative. So whereas Eden had been put on the ropes by Gaitskell, Macmillan is a different person. It's a bit like, going from Theresa May to Boris Johnson. It does kind of change the narrative of it. And in 59, to tell the truth, Labour had nothing to compete with this atmosphere of you've never had it so good. And they had an uncosted pension plan, and people feared tax rises. Irony, they got them anyway under Selwyn Lloyd because, of course, they promised far too much in the previous budget. The third problem that happens is after the election of 59, Labour do go bananas. They go from bitter division to lurching violently to the left. In 1960, the party conference, the trade union bloc, vote for unilateral disarmament. Even Bevan was opposed to that. Famously said to them, "Don't send me naked into the conference chamber." Gaitskell went on the offensive. That was a very Gaitskell-like thing to do. And he swore to fight, fight, fight again for the party I love. And he won. In 1961, the trade union bloc vote, the conference reversed the 60 decision, and Labour had been drawn back. Now, that's a much quicker process than happened in recent years, please note, of course, because the leadership was still very much from the moderate wing of the party. Gaitskell had won, and truth be told, looked as if he was going to take office with the Tories in a complete mess in 62, and looked as if he was going to become Prime Minister. Fate, in the form of the Grim Reaper, intervened. Gaitskell died suddenly in 63. The election for leader, and Labour elected their leaders via their MPs, was between Harold Wilson and George Brown. George Brown, brilliant, the leading Gaitskellite in many ways. I figure I'll talk about more fully next time. Wilson, seen as coming from the left, I think really Wilson's like Lloyd George, no fixed abode, a man who has no particular set ideology, certainly not in Labour terms. Famously, the Gaitskellite, Dick Crossman, said the contest was between a crook, Wilson, and a drunk, Brown. Wilson won. And that works because Wilson was, in fact, a brilliant opposition leader. He shredded Hume in the Commons, absolutely shredded Alec Douglas Hume. He was witty. He had the great man of the people image. He looked modern. He looked relatively young. His language, the white heat of the technological revolution, was again this song in the heartbeat. It gave an optimistic, upbeat message. Labour could change the way the economy worked. They could deal with the problems that the Conservatives had failed to deal with. And of course, there were the wasted years, the idea being Labour would not waste them. For all that, though, Labour's share of the vote doesn't really change in 64. Instead, the Conservative vote fell as the Liberals polled 11%. I've argued elsewhere that the Liberals, in many ways, pretty much won it for Labour. But by gum, it was tight. Now, 64 was vital for Labour. It got them back into government. Had they not won in 64? Problems, I think. But Wilson would go on and win big in 66, and that, if you like, is the coda to 1964, 98-seat majority, and would talk about Labour as the natural party of government. Just after that, it would all go pear-shaped. But we'll leave Harold in that happy place for now. Whatever else Wilson did, he would deliver in the end 4 election victories for Labour, and in 1966 he delivered Labour's second big election victory, one of only 2 if you don't count Tony Blair.